The rumble of the ferry's ancient engine vibrated through Dean's bones, a dull counterpoint to the hollow ache in his chest. He watched the gray maw of the ocean swallow the last vestiges of the mainland, the distant shore blurring into the relentless fog that clung to the horizon like a shroud. This was it then. No turning back. He clutched the worn leather strap of his satchel, its familiar weight a small comfort in the face of the vast, indifferent sea. The air tasted of salt and something else. Something metallic and cold, like old iron left out in the rain. He had sought refuge, a blank canvas for a life that felt smudged beyond recognition. The solicitor's voice, crisp and detached, had offered this inheritance. A remote island, a forgotten cottage, a grandfather he'd never known. Dean, the cartographer, usually thrived on precision, on lines drawn and boundaries defined. Now his own life felt like an uncharted territory, and this island, Aethel, was the edge of his known world. The ferry, a rusty, squat vessel named the Solace, eventually slowed. Through the swirling mist, a jagged silhouette emerged. The island. It wasn't welcoming. A single gaunt lighthouse stood sentinel at its highest point, its light a weak pulse in the thick air, more a sigh than a warning. The boatman, a burly figure with a beard like spun rope, gestured towards a narrow, barnacle-encrusted jetty. "Last stop, Dean. Don't get many visitors out here." His voice was gruff, devoid of warmth. Dean nodded, already feeling the profound isolation settle around him. He slung his pack over his shoulder, the canvas rubbing against his damp jacket. The ferry's ramp groaned down, spitting him onto the slick, seaweed-strewn planks. The boatman offered no farewell, merely a curt nod before the ferry's engine roared back to life, turning its back on the island, leaving Dean utterly alone. He inhaled deeply, the air thick with the smell of brine and decaying kelp. But beneath that, a fainter, stranger scent lingered. Something musky, like damp earth and old bone, an odor that prickled at the back of his throat. A narrow, winding path, barely more than a goat track, snaked up from the jetty. It was overgrown with hardy, wind-stunted bushes, their branches clawing at the mist. Dean started the ascent, his boots crunching on loose gravel and shells. The fog seemed to thicken with every step, pressing in, blurring the edges of his vision, making the world feel claustrophobic and vast all at once. He passed a derelict structure, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the swirling gray. It was the island's old weather station, a testament to forgotten purpose. Windows were shattered, gaping like empty eye sockets, and the corrugated iron roof had peeled back in places, revealing the damp, rotting timbers beneath. A rusted anemometer, frozen in time, pointed uselessly towards the sky. There it was, the lighthouse keeper's cottage. It stood hunched against the elements, a squat stone structure that looked as if it had grown organically from the very rock it rested upon. Its walls were streaked with salt and lichen, the windows opaque with grime. A rusted iron gate hung crookedly from a single hinge, its squeal in the wind a lonely greeting. Dean pushed open the gate, the sound grating. The garden was a tangle of weeds and thorny brambles, reclaiming what little order had once existed. He walked up to the heavy oak door, scarred and weathered, its paint long since peeled away. It turned with a reluctant click, echoing in the profound quiet. He pushed the door open. A gust of stale, damp air, thick with the scent of mildew and something indefinably old, washed over him. He stepped inside, his footsteps muffled by a thick layer of dust. The cottage was small, 2 rooms downstairs, 2 up. Furniture, draped in dusty white sheets, loomed like forgotten ghosts. On its surface, lying face down, was a single object. Its surface was smooth, cool to the touch, and strangely unblemished by the pervasive dust. He turned it over. There was no clasp, no hinge, no visible seam. It was a solid block of wood, yet he felt certain it was a container, What truly unsettled him were the carvings, not the usual maritime motifs of anchors or waves, but a series of swirling, almost organic patterns that resolved into unsettling half-formed shapes. They looked like tentacles, or perhaps roots, twisting and intertwining, culminating in a central symbol that resembled a jagged, unblinking eye. It felt ancient, heavy, and wrong. A low, distant sound, like something vast shifting far beneath the waves, seemed to vibrate through the very stone of the cottage. He was here, on this desolate rock, and the solitude he had craved was already beginning to feel less like a balm and more like a trap. The ferry's horn, a mournful bellow, faded into the relentless gray, leaving Dean enveloped in a silence that felt less like peace and more like a vacuum. The cottage, squat and defiant against the elements, stood on a craggy outcrop overlooking a churning expanse of sea. Its weathered stones seemed to absorb the light, drawing him into its ancient, damp embrace. Inside, the air hung heavy with the scent of salt, mildew, and something else. A faint metallic tang he couldn't quite place. He dropped his duffel bag, the thud echoing in the small, sparsely furnished living space. Dust motes danced in the sparse light filtering through the grime-streaked windows, illuminating decades of neglect. This was it. His refuge. He spent the first few hours moving methodically, the kind of mundane task that grounded him. He wiped down surfaces, swept away cobwebs, and unpacked his few belongings. As evening approached, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes like skeletal fingers. He tried to light the old oil lamp, its wick stubbornly refusing to catch, forcing him to rely on a battery-powered lantern. Its beam cast long, dancing shadows, turning familiar corners into shifting, ominous shapes. The first oddity came with the tide. He had noted the high water mark on the rocks near the cottage, a clear line etched by countless surges. But as he watched from the living room window, the waves rolled in higher, greedier than they should have been, licking at the very base of the cottage's foundation. He was a man of maps and measurements, accustomed to the predictable rhythms of the world. This was an aberration. He consulted the tide charts he'd brought, cross-referencing them with his grandfather's old almanac found tucked away in a drawer. The numbers didn't match, not even close. But the explanation felt flimsy, like a patch on a gaping wound. At first, he dismissed them as the wind, a mournful sigh through the eaves, or the roar of the ocean distorted by the rough-hewn walls. But then, a distinct cadence emerged, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to coil around the sound of the surf. It wasn't language, not exactly, but a suggestion of it, a sound that felt both ancient and deeply unsettling. He gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, listening intently. The sound ebbed and flowed, sometimes a collective drone, sometimes a singular drawn-out groan. He told himself it was the isolation, the profound quiet amplifying every creak and groan of the old house, playing tricks on his frayed nerves. He needed to get out, clear his head. The next morning, driven by a need for external validation of the island's peculiar nature, Dean decided to investigate the weather station. It was a small, dilapidated structure, a beacon of forgotten science perched on the highest point of the island, a mile or so from the cottage. The hike was arduous, the path overgrown and slippery with sea spray. The station itself was a skeletal ruin of rusted metal and splintered wood, its anemometer frozen in a perpetual spin, its wind vane pointing uselessly seaward. He expected to find remnants of instruments, perhaps a logbook. Instead, tucked beneath a corroded metal plate that once housed a barometer, he found it. It was a journal, its leather cover warped and stiff, the pages swollen and discolored by water damage. He recognized his grandfather's distinctive sprawling hand on the first page. The entries were sparse at first, observations of weather and sea conditions, precise and methodical, just as Dean expected. But as he turned the pages, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew erratic, the observations interspersed with frantic, almost childlike sketches. And then the words, scrawled in hurried, desperate strokes. The tides are wrong. The sound, it's not the wind, it's a song. His breath hitched. He flipped through more pages. They stir beneath, the deep song, it calls. The phrase appeared repeatedly, often underlined multiple times, sometimes surrounded by circles and crosses, as if his grandfather were trying to ward off some unseen evil. His cottage. This wasn't just a strange island. It was a place where the rational mind wrestled with something ancient and unyielding. Dean closed the journal, the waterlogged pages sticking together with a soft, sickening sound. Perhaps his grandfather had been suffering from some form of dementia, his mind fabricating these horrors in his isolation. The island was remote, after all, and solitude could warp the sanest mind. The wind howled around the weather station, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible sound. A low, resonant hum that seemed to answer the unsettling thrum in Dean's own chest. The strange scrawl of his grandfather's journal had lodged itself beneath Dean's skin, an insidious splinter of unease. They stir beneath. The deep song. It calls. The words echoed in the silence of the cottage, a counterpoint to the relentless sigh of the ocean. He couldn't shake the feeling that the brittle, yellowed pages held not just a madman's ramblings, but a desperate warning. He needed answers, a tether back to something rational. His first thought was the small, weathered public building near the island's only dock, a place he'd briefly glimpsed on his arrival. It served as a general store, a post office, and, he hoped, an unofficial repository of local history. The air inside was thick with the scent of brine and damp wool. An elderly woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, peered at him over spectacles perched on her nose. He was the island's unofficial archivist, the proprietor had explained, a keeper of forgotten stories. "Looking for old tales, are we?" she rasped, her voice like dry leaves skittering across cobblestones. She led him to a back room, a cramped space overflowing with dusty ledgers, maps yellowed with age, and stacks of local gazettes. Dean explained his grandfather's former residence, and the woman's eyes held a flicker of something he couldn't quite decipher. Pity? Recognition? He spent hours hunched over a heavy wooden table, the air thick with the smell of mildewed paper. He sifted through faded newspaper clippings detailing shipwrecks, fishing hauls, and the relentless fog. Then he found them. Mentions, scarce and often dismissive, of a sunken city legend. Old fishermen's tales, they were called. Whispers of a civilization swallowed by the depths, its inhabitants transformed, its gods still worshipped in secret rites by a few isolated families. One short piece from the late 1800s mentioned an unnatural phosphorescence, observed in the waters during a particularly dense fog, dismissed as a trick of the light or a rare plankton bloom. His grandfather's journal had described a strange glow, a living light. The fragmented accounts began to coalesce in his mind, aligning with the increasingly legible entries in his grandfather's journal. The older man's wild drawings of undulating shapes and gaping maws now seemed less like hallucination and more like distorted echoes of the ancient stories. His frantic scribbles about a pact and a debt started to make a terrifying kind of sense. The legend spoke of offerings, of appeasement to the beings that dwelled below. Was this what his grandfather had been so desperately trying to understand, or perhaps to escape? A young meteorologist, all clipped efficiency and scientific precision, gave him access to the historical weather logs. Dean wasn't looking for atmospheric pressure or wind speed, though. He was looking for anomalies. He found entries, sporadic and often accompanied by notes of exasperation, describing unusual seismic activity that didn't correlate with known fault lines, particularly during periods of extreme low tide. One log from a decade prior, handwritten by a different observer, detailed a deep, resonant hum emanating from beneath the sea, lasting for hours and causing a disturbing vibration throughout the station. The meteorologist, noticing Dean's focus, shrugged it off as a faulty sensor or an odd submarine echo. Dean knew better. That night, the dreams began in earnest. He was falling, always falling, through an endless column of frigid water. Pressures built around him, crushing. He heard the deep song, not as a melody, but as a vast resonant thrum that vibrated through his very bones, threatening to unravel him. He saw glimmers of impossible architecture, colossal structures formed from black stone, encrusted with barnacles that pulsed with a faint, sickly light. He lay there for a long time, listening to the wind howl and the waves crash against the shore, trying to reorient himself to the familiar, if desolate, reality of the cottage. The dream lingered, a viscid film over his senses. He finally swung his legs out of bed, his bare feet meeting the cold stone floor. As he stood, a faint, ethereal glow caught his eye. It wasn't moonlight. Near the base of the hearth, where the old stone met the floorboards, a patch of something shimmered. He knelt, his breath catching in his throat. It was a growth, a thin, delicate filigree of vibrant, impossible blue-green. Bioluminescent algae. It pulsed softly, like a slow, deep breath, casting a faint, otherworldly light on the dusty floor. He touched it tentatively. It felt slick, cool, and slightly gelatinous, yet surprisingly firm. He pulled his hand back quickly, a shudder running through him. More patches. A faint vein of the glowing growth snaked up the damp stone of the chimney. Another bloomed like a tiny luminous fungus in the corner of the small pantry. Even a small patch clung to the underside of the ancient water-stained wooden table in the kitchen, casting a pallid glow on the rough-hewn surface. It was here, inside his home. It was spreading. The deep song was no longer just a whisper in his dreams. It was blossoming, tangible and terrifying, in the very fabric of his inherited solitude. They stir beneath. The deep song. The low thrumming began subtly, a vibration more felt than heard. It started in the floorboards beneath his worn boots, a deep, resonant pulse that climbed his calves, settled in his chest. It wasn't the house settling, nor the groan of the wind against the eaves. This was a sustained hum, like a giant unseen bell resonating far beneath the earth, or perhaps far beneath the waves. It pressed against his eardrums, a silent pressure that made his teeth ache. He tried to pinpoint its origin, moving from the kitchen to the study, then to the bedroom, but it seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere. A ubiquitous presence. He paused by the desk, his gaze snagging on the heavy brass compass he kept there. He'd meticulously aligned it north that morning, a habit from his cartography days. Now the needle quivered, then spun wildly, tracing erratic arcs before settling, not north, but pointing stubbornly west towards the open, churning sea. He tapped the glass, but it remained fixed, mocking his perception of order. He reached for a framed photograph, an old image of himself as a boy, laughing beside his grandfather, the lighthouse a distant sentinel behind them. The hum intensified, a hypnotic drone that threatened to unravel his thoughts. He felt a desperate urge to do something, to understand what his grandfather had faced. He began to search the cottage with renewed urgency, not just for more entries, but for anything that might suggest an act of defense, a desperate measure against the encroaching strangeness. He started in the study, systematically pulling books from shelves, tapping walls, running his hands along every crevice. Behind a loose panel near the fireplace, hidden by a stack of nautical charts, he found it. A small, shallow cavity. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried seaweed, was a collection of objects that made his stomach clench. There were several small, smooth stones, each etched with a crude, spiraling symbol that vaguely resembled a coil of rope or a breaking wave. A handful of rusty iron nails arranged in a tight circle. His grandfather hadn't just observed. He had actively struggled, perhaps even made offerings. The air in the cottage grew heavy, thick with the pervasive hum and a new, subtle scent brine mixed with something else, something metallic and ancient, like deep-sea silt stirred up from aeons of sleep. His grandfather had maintained it, meticulously recording atmospheric pressure and wind speed, long after it had ceased to be officially needed. Dean remembered him spending hours there, sometimes returning with a haunted look in his eyes. Perhaps there were more answers there, away from the suffocating pressure of the cottage walls. He pulled on his heaviest coat, the wind already tearing at the fabric as he stepped outside. The hum followed him, seeming to amplify in the open air, carried on the damp wind. The path to the weather station was treacherous, slick with sea spray and moss-covered stones. Its single small window was opaque with salt spray, its wooden door warped and peeling. Dean fumbled with the rusted latch, forcing the door open with a groan that seemed to echo unnaturally loud. A battered wooden table dominated the small space, littered with yellowed charts, old logbooks, and a rusted barometer. On one of the charts, Dean saw his grandfather's familiar hand. But instead of typical weather patterns, there were strange concentric circles drawn in faded ink, radiating outwards from a point deep in the ocean, accompanied by the same spiraling symbols he'd found in the cottage. His gaze drifted to a corner of the room. It was an offering, a desperate plea. The hum intensified, vibrating through the very rock of the island. A movement caught his eye, not through the window, but from the open doorway. The fog outside seemed to coalesce, drawing itself inwards, thickening into a form that was neither entirely mist nor solid matter. It was tall, indistinct, but undeniably present, like a column of churning dark water. It seemed to reach for him, a tendril of inky blackness extending from its amorphous mass. Dean scrambled backward, his heart leaping into his throat, overturning the driftwood bowl with a clatter. The form paused, then surged forward, a soundless rush. He slammed the door shut with a desperate heave, the old wood groaning in protest. It was no longer a whisper in the journal, no longer a trick of light or sound. It was real. It was here. And it was coming for him. They stir beneath, the deep song. He laid the journal open on the worn kitchen table, the lamplight casting a jaundiced glow on the brittle pages. His fingers traced the frantic loops and jabs of his grandfather's script, a map of a mind under siege. Dean had spent days sifting through the later entries, the ones that spoke of the deep song and the stirring. Now he felt compelled to revisit the earlier passages, the ones he had dismissed as the ramblings of a solitary old man. He needed to find the beginning of this madness, or its root. The grandfather's initial entries were meticulous, observations of tides, weather patterns, and the peculiar behavior of the island's sparse wildlife. The gulls are fewer now, the fish too. A strange quiet descends upon the waters. Then, a subtle shift. Not just observation, but a sense of foreboding. The hum comes sometimes with the fog, a vibration, low and deep, felt in the bones. Dean remembered that hum, the one he'd dismissed as the old lighthouse machinery. He turned a page, the paper rustling like dry leaves. A drawing, crude but detailed, depicted a series of symbols he didn't recognize, arranged in a circle. Warding. Not just observing, then. His grandfather had been active. The deep song began its insidious work while Dean was engrossed. Then the rhythmic creak of the cottage settling seemed to stretch, becoming less like wood and more like something cartilaginous bending under immense pressure. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, trying to dispel the growing pressure behind his temples. When he opened them, the ink on the page seemed to shimmer, the letters momentarily blurring, then reforming into unfamiliar shapes before snapping back into place. He blinked, hard. Just fatigue, he told himself. The strain of deciphering the cryptic script. It wasn't external. It felt internal, a resonance within his own skull. He could almost discern words within the thrumming, guttural sounds, drawn out and slow, like stones grinding together beneath the sea. He found himself swaying slightly, a subtle vertigo washing over him. The lamp flickered, though there was no draft. He found a sequence of entries describing specific locations on the island. The northernmost point, where the rock splits. The old weather station facing the eastern swell. The hidden cove, where the tide never fully recedes. Each location was accompanied by a symbol similar to the warding drawing, though subtly altered. Points of the anchor, to hold it fast. His grandfather hadn't just been documenting a phenomenon. He had been performing a ritual, a desperate, solitary act to keep something dormant. And now, with his grandfather gone, who was holding the anchor? The deep song wasn't just a metaphor. It was a force, something that needed to be bound. A new entry caught his eye, one near the end of the journal, almost illegible due to the wild, desperate strokes. The light, it weakens, the foundations, it seeks the heart. Below the heart, the chamber, the final seal. Below the heart. Dean's gaze instinctively drifted to the lighthouse, its beams sweeping through the fog outside. The heart of the lighthouse. He'd explored the main structure, the spiral stairs, the lamp room, the living quarters. But what was below? The hum was a dull ache now, a constant companion. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight, Dean descended the familiar wooden stairs to the base of the lighthouse tower. He swept the beam across the rough-hewn walls, revealing nothing but ancient mortar and solid rock. He ran his hand along the cold stone, searching for any anomaly. The final seal. He reached the very bottom, where the spiral staircase ended at a heavy, bolted door that led to an exterior platform. He'd always assumed this was the lowest accessible point. But his grandfather's words. Below the heart, the chamber. He knelt, shining the light at the floor. It was a mosaic of large, irregularly shaped flagstones, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Most were solid, immovable. But near the base of the central column, where the tower's immense weight seemed to press deepest into the earth, one stone shifted. It was barely perceptible, a slight give beneath his palm, accompanied by a faint metallic groan. He pushed harder, felt it dip. There was a faint, almost imperceptible seam around its edges, expertly disguised. With renewed urgency, he searched for a lever, a hidden mechanism. He tugged. It resisted, stubbornly. He pulled again, putting his full weight into it. With a deafening shriek of ancient metal against stone, the flagstone lifted, revealing a gaping blackness beneath. A hidden chamber. A crypt. The flagstone near the column's immense base felt different. A faint tremor, a yielding beneath his knuckles that the others lacked. He ran his fingers along its edges, tracing the hairline cracks in the mortar. The air, already thick with the scent of salt and ancient stone, seemed to press in, making his breath shallow. Dean felt a prickle of unease, a premonition settling deep in his bones. But his determination to uncover the island's secrets was a stronger current, pulling him forward. He found the subtle seam, a barely perceptible line that suggested not a crack, but a lid. The metallic rasp against stone was the only sound in the vast, silent tower. He pressed against the stone with his shoulder, then tried to pry it with the tool, but it held fast. He needed leverage. Rummaging through a toolbox he'd brought up, he found a sturdy crowbar. The first tentative pry made a groan echo through the tower, a sound like an old beast stirring. He leaned into it, muscles straining, and with a final grinding shriek of stone against stone, a section of the flagstone mosaic shifted inward, then descended, revealing a dark, square opening. A gust of colder, damper air rushed out, carrying with it a strange metallic tang, like old blood and rust, mixed with the brine of the deep. A set of rough-hewn stone steps spiraled down into the black. Each step was treacherous, slick with moisture. The air grew heavier, pressing against his eardrums, and the metallic smell intensified, making his stomach churn. He could hear the faint drip of water somewhere below, a sound that seemed to measure the slow, inexorable passage of time. The stairs ended abruptly in a small, circular chamber, no larger than a storage closet. The walls were rough rock, perpetually weeping moisture. His light played over them, revealing crude carvings etched into the stone. They depicted strange, angular figures, not human, not animal, but something in between, writhing in what looked like an ocean of jagged lines. But it was not these that captured his attention. He picked up the topmost journal. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded, but he could make out the spidery handwriting of his grandfather. The entries spoke of the hum, of the pull, of the true eye of the deep. One entry, dated decades ago, was underlined repeatedly. It calls from the weather station. The storm is merely its breath. The weather station. He knew the place. A small, derelict structure on the island's highest, most exposed bluff, long abandoned. He'd always assumed it was just a relic, another crumbling piece of the island's past. Now it echoed with a sinister significance. The obsidian shard seemed to pulse faster in his hand, a dull warmth spreading through his palm. He stuffed the journals into his backpack, the sextant clattering against them, and ascended the steps, a new, terrifying urgency propelling him. The climb out of the lighthouse chamber and the subsequent sprint across the windswept island to the weather station was a blur of raw adrenaline. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with unspoken threats. The weather station, when he finally reached it, stood like a skeletal sentinel against the churning horizon, its windows long since shattered, its corrugated iron roof peeling back like a scab. Inside, the air was still and strangely warm, despite the gale outside. The interior was stripped bare, save for a single large circular depression in the concrete floor, directly beneath a gaping hole in the roof. Rain would have poured through it, yet the depression was dry, almost unnaturally so. And in its center, pulsating with an eerie, rhythmic light, lay the true heart of the revelation. It was not an artifact, not in the traditional sense. It was a pool, perhaps 3 feet across, of a viscous, shimmering liquid that swirled with impossible colors. Deep indigos, sickly greens, and flashes of a lightless black that seemed to absorb all other hues. It pulsed, a slow, deep thrum that resonated not just in his ears, but in his very bones, vibrating through his teeth. As Dean stared into the swirling pool, the pulsing light intensified, and the metallic tang in the air grew so potent it burned his nostrils. The swirling colors in the liquid began to coalesce, forming grotesque, fleeting images. He saw the island, but not as it was. Its familiar contours warped and stretched, the rock buckling, the soil turning to a slick, black ooze. The lighthouse, his home, dissolved into a skeletal ruin, its lamp a single baleful eye staring into a storm of impossible scale. He saw himself too, but twisted, elongated, his skin like wet parchment, his eyes wide and black, his mouth a gaping chasm from which an unearthly shriek tore. He was sinking, consumed by the black water, becoming part of the writhing, formless mass that pulsed beneath the waves. The vision intensified, not just a sight, but a feeling, an invasion of his very being. It was not merely taking the island, it was reshaping it, consuming it, making it an extension of its own terrible will. He was not just witnessing destruction, he was experiencing a profound existential erasure. The entity didn't want to kill him. It wanted to absorb him, to make his consciousness a mere ripple in its unfathomable mind. He stumbled backward, choking on the metallic air, his hand flying to his mouth to stifle a scream that threatened to tear his throat. The pool continued its hypnotic thrum, the iridescent mist curling higher, reaching, it seemed, for him. The ancient pact, his grandfather's warnings, the hum beneath the waves. It all clicked into a horrifying, coherent picture. The entity was here, awake, and it had claimed the island. And Dean, the last remaining link, the new keeper, was now inextricably bound to its terrible, encroaching reality. The words chilled him to the bone. The weather station. Now it echoed with a sinister significance. He stood inside the weather station, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and rust. The single room was cramped, its windows long shattered or boarded over, leaving only slits for the wind to shriek through. A rusted anemometer still clung precariously to the roof, groaning in the ceaseless gale. The cold seeped into his bones, a deeper chill than the mere ocean air, a frigid pressure that felt like it was pressing in from all sides. He was trapped, not by physical barriers, but by the burgeoning presence that now filled every inch of the small structure. The entity was here. He could feel it, a vast, formless weight settling around him, a profound wrongness that buzzed at the edge of his perception. It wasn't just around him. It felt like it was trying to seep into him, a slow, insidious invasion. He pressed a hand to his temple, feeling a dull ache blossom behind his eyes. They weren't words, not exactly, but a clamor of alien thoughts, a tidal surge of something ancient and hungry. It felt like his mind was a fragile barrier, and the entity was a probing tide, testing its resilience, looking for cracks. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push back against the psychic assault. It was trying to break through, to possess him, to claim him entirely. Panic, sharp and acrid, clawed at his throat. He was alone, utterly isolated on this desolate rock, with nothing but a crumbling journal and his own fraying sanity as protection. His fingers fumbled for the leather-bound journal, pulling it from his satchel with a desperate urgency. Its familiar weight was a meager comfort. He needed answers, something, anything, to push back this encroaching horror. His grandfather's sprawling script blurred before his eyes. He scanned for keywords: seal, bind, repel, end. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the overwhelming pressure in the air. He found it. Not a complete solution, but a fragmented section, scribbled in what looked like a particularly agitated hand. It detailed a final, desperate measure. The text was cryptic, filled with archaic terms and references to energies and anchors. Dean's eyes darted across the lines, deciphering the faded words. It spoke of a conduit, a vessel, a final committal. He swallowed, his throat suddenly parched. The ritual wasn't about banishing the entity outright, not truly. It was about creating an impenetrable barrier, a permanent seal. And the seal required a sacrifice. He read the words again, slowly this time, letting their terrible meaning sink in. The anchor must be bound, not of stone or metal, but of spirit, to become the sentinel, the eternal watcher, bound to the threshold, forever guarding against the breach. A sacrifice of self to become the cage. A sacrifice of self, not his life, not a limb, but his self, his mind, his identity, to become a part of the seal, a living conscious barrier, forever tethered to the island, to the threshold of the deep. He would become a silent, sentient guard, his consciousness slowly dissolving into the ancient power of the ward, losing all sense of who he was, what he had been. He would exist, but not as Dean. It was a terrifying obliteration, a living death more profound than any grave. His breath hitched. He could feel it trying to pry open his will. But the journal offered a choice, a terrible one, but a choice nonetheless. Or he could choose to sacrifice himself, to become the prison. to willingly surrender his identity to seal the ancient horror away. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, heavier than any physical burden. The wind howled outside, a mournful dirge for the man he was, the man he might soon cease to be. He looked at the faded script, at the terrible truth it laid bare. He was trapped, terrified, but he would not simply break. He would choose his end, however horrific. He would make the sacrifice. The island churned, not with the familiar rhythmic violence of a winter gale, but with a deeper, more malicious energy. Dean watched from the cottage window, his knuckles white against the sill. The sky above was a bruised purple mass, not quite dawn, not quite dusk, but a perpetual, sickly twilight. Rain lashed horizontally, stinging the glass, yet it wasn't water that fell. He felt the pressure in his skull, a constant low thrumming that vibrated behind his eyes, distorting the edges of his vision. It wasn't just the storm, it was the entity, asserting its will, tearing at the fabric of the island, and by extension, at him. The familiar crags outside were no longer merely rock. Their surfaces seemed to writhe, slick with a glistening dark film, their ancient contours subtly shifting as if the very stone was breathing. Patches of kelp, usually clinging to submerged rocks, now lay draped over the shore, pulsating faintly, their fronds elongating into tendrils that seemed to grip the pebbles. The air itself felt heavy, saturated not just with moisture, but with a palpable dread that sunk into his bones. He understood now. The journal's final cryptic entries, the mad scrawls of his grandfather, had been a desperate plea, a map to a terrible salvation. A sacrifice of self. Not his life, not a limb, but his self. His mind, his identity. He wasn't just to perform a ritual. He was to become the ritual. To offer up the very essence of what made him Dean, to be consumed and transmuted into a living component of the ward that kept the horror at bay. The thought made his stomach clench, a wave of nausea washing over him that had nothing to do with the rocking of the cottage in the storm. He would cease to be. His memories, his grief, his love for the lost, his very perception of self, all would be subsumed, dissolved into a cosmic mortar binding the breach. He would be a consciousness without agency, a sentience without a self, a guardian without memory. It was a fate worse than any physical death he could imagine. There was no other choice. He turned from the window, his gaze sweeping over the familiar, now eerie interior of the cottage. The old, chipped ceramic mug on the table, the worn armchair, the stacks of maps, all artifacts of a life he was about to surrender. He picked up the journal, its leather cover slick with sweat from his palm. Its final pages detailed the precise sequence, the specific incantations, the items required for the counter-ritual. Not grand, arcane relics, but simple, elemental things. A shard of volcanic rock from the island's highest peak, a vial of the deepest seawater, a feather from a scavenging gull, and a drop of his own blood mingled with his tears. A symbolic offering of his past, his present, and his future. He moved with a grim purpose, gathering the items. The volcanic rock he'd collected weeks ago, a jagged obsidian fragment. The seawater he'd drawn from a deep tide pool, now sitting in a stoppered bottle, unnervingly still amidst the chaos. A gull's feather found impaled in the sand after a particularly fierce squall. He set them out on the worn table, each object radiating a strange, potent energy in the dim, unnatural light. The journey to the weather station would be treacherous. The journal specified that the ritual had to be performed at the island's highest point, the place where the earth met the most turbulent skies. The weather station, a squat, concrete structure, was perched precariously on that very peak. Its instruments designed to measure the world's fury, now bearing witness to something far beyond its scope. As he stepped out of the cottage, the elements assaulted him. The air was thick and heavy, like breathing through wet wool. The viscous rain slicked the rocky path, making every step a perilous slide. Dean pulled his oilskins tighter, the fabric clinging to his skin, already damp. The ground beneath his boots felt soft, yielding in places, as if the very earth was softening, dissolving into something primordial. He kept his eyes fixed on the distant, blocky silhouette of the weather station, a beacon of grim necessity in the swirling gloom. The climb was an ordeal. The wind threatened to rip him from the path. The rain plastered his hair to his face, and the ever-present psychic pressure threatened to buckle his knees. But he pushed on, driven by the stark, terrifying clarity of his purpose. He was a vessel, a final, desperate instrument. Finally, he reached the base of the weather station. A low hum emanated from within, a sound that vibrated not just in the air, but in his very bones. The door, usually bolted, now hung ajar, groaning on rusted hinges, as if inviting him in. The air inside was stagnant, heavy with the scent of ozone and decay. This was the threshold. This was where it would happen. He placed the journal on a battered console, its pages fluttering in a non-existent draft. He laid out the volcanic rock, the vial of seawater, the gull's feather. He drew a small, sharp knife from his pocket, a tool he'd used for trimming maps, now destined for a far more intimate purpose. His hand trembled, but his gaze was steady. He was ready to pay the cost. He was ready to become the seal. The island churned. He pulled his thick oilskin tighter, the canvas stiff against his shoulders, and stepped out. The air was a palpable weight, pressing down like a deep-sea current. Every breath felt thin, inadequate. The earth beneath his boots felt spongy, yielding, as if the very ground was dissolving. He gripped the heavy, tarnished brass lantern, its beam cutting a weak, bobbing tunnel through the unnatural gloom. The path to the lighthouse, usually a familiar winding track, was now a treacherous nightmare. Gulls shrieked overhead, not in their usual scavenging cries, but in frantic, panicked squalls that seemed to tear at the fabric of the sky. The surf crashed against the cliffs with an impossible roar, a sound that bypassed his ears and vibrated directly in his chest, a low, guttural thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock of the island. His mind felt like a fragile glass, vibrating on the edge of shattering. He pushed through the creeping dread, focusing on the lighthouse, a distant skeletal finger against the bruised sky. He had to complete the ritual. His grandfather's cryptic journal, clutched tight in his inner pocket, was his only guide. Its faded ink now a desperate plea from the past. He had deciphered the final entry, a desperate half-mad warning about the entity's return and the ultimate price of its sealing. The wind picked up, howling like a banshee, tearing at his clothes, trying to pull his back, to drag him down into the churning chaos. He stumbled, his legs sinking into a patch of ground that felt like cold, wet clay. He hauled himself free, his muscles screaming. He reached the weather station, a small, squat building of gray stone that stood like a sentinel before the final ascent to the lighthouse. Its windows, usually boarded, were now shattered, gaping black holes. A low moan, like a ship's hull groaning under immense pressure, emanated from within. He hesitated, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. This was where his grandfather had made his last stand, according to the journal's implied narrative, before retreating to the lighthouse. Driven by a sudden, desperate intuition, Dean pushed open the heavy, waterlogged door. The interior was a shambles of broken equipment and scattered papers. The air was thick with the metallic, ancient scent. In the center of the room, amidst the debris, a small, carved wooden box lay open. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried seaweed, was a single smooth black stone, no larger than his thumb. He recognized it immediately from the journal's crude sketches, the anchor stone, the key to the ritual, somehow overlooked in his previous searches. His grandfather hadn't just written about the pact. He had prepared for its breaking. This was the reveal he hadn't known he needed. A tangible link to his past. A final desperate gift. The moaning sound intensified, twisting into a guttural growl that seemed to vibrate from the very stones of the weather station. He didn't linger, scrambling back out into the maelstrom. The final climb to the lighthouse was a desperate ascent. The air was thick, heavy, like breathing liquid. It wasn't just in the water or under the island. It was here, reaching, twisting the very air around him. As he burst into the lantern room, the entity's full manifestation hit him like a physical blow. The air shimmered, distorting the very architecture of the room. The sound was deafening now. The roar of the ocean, the shriek of the wind, the low, resonant thrumming, all coalescing into a single, impossible chord that threatened to tear his sanity apart. They weren't solid, not truly, but they exerted a crushing pressure, making the thick glass groan. Dean staggered, clutching his head, the black stone burning in his pocket. They spoke of the loved one he had lost, twisting her image, her last words, into mocking echoes. This was the psychological attack, the entity preying on his deepest wound. "No," he rasped, his voice raw, barely audible above the cacophony. He pulled out his grandfather's journal, flipping to the final marked page. The ritual required the anchor stone, a drop of his own blood, and a final binding incantation, spoken from the heart of the lighthouse. But there was another line, scrawled in a shaky hand, almost illegible. The pact demands a life for a life, a binding sacrifice. He understood then. The entity wasn't just demanding a seal, it demanded a return. And the anchor was a soul. His grandfather had delayed, but Dean knew with a terrible certainty that it had to be him. This was the profound personal sacrifice. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of brine and metallic decay filling his lungs. He pulled out the small, sharp knife he carried, the same one he used for his maps. He placed the black stone on the brass railing surrounding the lantern mechanism. With a grimace, he sliced open his palm, a sharp, clean cut, and let a bead of blood fall onto the warm, pulsating surface of the stone. The tendrils outside the glass recoiled, hissing, their phosphorescent glow flickering. He had made his choice. He began to chant the words from the journal, his voice cracking but resolute, fighting against the crushing pressure, the deafening roar. The ancient language felt alien on his tongue, but he pushed through, pouring all his will, all his sorrow, all his determination into each syllable. The pressure in the room eased just slightly, enough for him to continue. The image of the loved one he had lost, once a source of unbearable pain, now settled into a quiet, resigned ache. He was doing this for her, for everyone. The impossible geometries vanished. The crushing weight lifted. The air, though still heavy with ozone and salt, felt breathable again. The lantern room was silent, save for the distant, rhythmic crash of the waves. The glass panes, though still streaked with an oily residue, were clear once more. The green light from the lamp returned to its steady, comforting beam. The entity was sealed, but he was sealed with it. He understood then. It needed to be anchored, not merely locked away. And the anchor was a soul. This was the profound personal sacrifice. He had come to the island seeking solitude, a balm for his grief. Instead, he had found a deeper, more ancient sorrow, and a purpose that would consume him entirely. A cold, resolute calm settled over him, chilling him far more than the raw wind clawing at the cottage's foundations. There was no escape, not truly. The island itself was an extension of the entity now, its very soil thrumming with an abyssal pulse. He had felt it in the stones, in the crashing waves, in the air thick with brine and something else, something ancient and hungry. He had seen the way the light bent, the colors bled, the world distorting at the edges. To flee would be to carry the deep song within him, to become a walking conduit of its encroaching madness, scattering its influence across the mainland. No, the burden had to remain here, contained. He had to become the container. He pulled on his thickest coat, the wool rough against his skin, and secured the oil lantern. Its feeble glow was a laughable defiance against the encroaching gloom, but it was all he had. The path to the weather station was treacherous, winding along the cliff edge where the wind howled like a banshee, tearing at his clothes. Below, the ocean churned, a black, roiling expanse that seemed to claw its way up the sheer rock face. The air tasted of salt and something metallic, like old blood, and a deep, guttural hum vibrated through the ground, rising from the depths. It was the deep song, clearer now, a chorus of crushing pressures and silent screams calling to him. The weather station stood on the highest point of the island, a squat stone structure battered by countless storms. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something acrid, a chemical tang that made his nose prickle. His grandfather had spent his last days here, meticulously tracking the deepening anomaly, charting not just the weather, but the slow, inexorable rise of the thing below. On a workbench, amidst a scatter of rusted tools and a half-eaten tin of biscuits, lay a journal. Dean recognized his grandfather's spidery handwriting. He picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly. The last entry was brief, dated just days before the old man's disappearance. The anchor must be set. The song demands it. Not a lock, but a bridge. A soul for the chasm. Forgive me, Dean. The words solidified his understanding, stripping away any lingering doubt. His grandfather hadn't simply vanished. He had prepared the way, leaving the ultimate choice to his unwitting heir. Dean was the last link in a chain stretching back into forgotten time, a lineage of reluctant guardians. He moved to the center of the small room, placing the lantern on a sturdy wooden crate. The hum intensified, vibrating through the soles of his boots, up his legs, into his very bones. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, vast and ancient, pressing in on all sides. It sought entry, sought release. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. He thought of his quiet life, his maps, the intricate lines and contours that had once defined his world. He opened his eyes. The air grew heavy, thick, as if the very atmosphere were solidifying. It was the sound of everything and nothing, of creation and oblivion. He extended his hands, not in supplication, but in acceptance. Memories, fears, desires, all were laid bare, examined, then meticulously, terrifyingly, reordered. He felt his own essence begin to unravel, thread by thread, dissolving into the vast ancient consciousness that sought to merge. There was no pain, not physical, but a profound existential agony as his sense of self began to blur. He was no longer Dean, the cartographer, the grieving man. He was becoming a vessel, a living anchor, a conduit for the deep song. The entity was not locked away. It was within him, held in a delicate, terrible balance. When it was done, the roar subsided into a dull thrum, a constant vibration deep within him. The phosphorescence faded. The air cleared, though it still tasted of brine and ancient things. Dean stood in the weather station, but he was not the man who had entered. He looked at his hands, seeing not just his own skin, but the faint, shimmering patterns of the deep song woven into the very fabric of his being. He walked to the window, the movement stiff, deliberate. Outside, the storm had broken. The sky was a bruised purple, but the sea, though still heaving, no longer seemed to claw. A heavy mist rolled in, shrouding the island, an impenetrable veil. He would stay here, in the weather station, in the cottage, always listening, always maintaining the anchor. The solitude he had sought was now absolute, eternal. He was the island's new guardian, forever bound to its terrible secret, a silent sentinel against the encroaching deep. The future was not shattered. It was simply unending, a perpetual twilight of the soul.